As the sun dips below the horizon, a quiet neighborhood street becomes the stage for an unsettling encounter. Officer Thomas, a man known for his prejudiced views, spots a black man walking alone. What begins as a simple stop will ignite a chain of events that no one could have predicted. We open with Officer Thomas, an experienced cop, patrolling a neighborhood he's always looked down on. He has a reputation for being tough, aggressive, and, more importantly, racist. His interactions with the residents of this area are often filled with disdain, and he's quick to assume the worst about anyone he encounters, especially if they are black. One evening, while on patrol, Thomas spots Derek, a black man, walking down the street. Derek seems calm, but there's an air of tension around him. He's wearing casual clothes, nothing particularly suspicious. But for Thomas, the fact that Derek is out at night in this part of town is enough to raise suspicion. Derek's posture, his brief glance at the cop, it all seems off to Thomas. He decides to stop him. As Officer Thomas approaches Derek, he already has his mind made up. He'll find something to charge him with, even if he has to make it up. The officer's immediate judgment is based solely on the color of Derek's skin and his assumptions about the neighborhood. This sets the tone for the story and immediately establishes the central theme: systemic racism and the abuse of power. What begins as a routine stop spirals into a moment of power and control, as Officer Thomas makes a life-changing decision, one that will not only challenge his prejudices, but will soon unravel his entire worldview. The scene shifts to Officer Thomas confronting Derek. He starts with a seemingly innocent question, asking Derek where he's going, trying to gauge his reactions. Derek answers in a calm, measured tone, providing a vague but innocent response about heading home after a late shift at work. His tone remains respectful, not confrontational, but this only irritates Officer Thomas. Thomas, already predisposed to suspicion, reads too much into Derek's calm demeanor, interpreting it as evasiveness or defiance. Thomas, feeling slighted and determined to assert his authority, escalates the interaction. He demands Derek's ID and begins to pat him down, despite there being no reasonable cause. Derek, understanding his rights, questions the need for this search but remains calm and non-aggressive. His compliance does nothing to appease the officer's growing frustration. As Derek tries to move on from the questioning, Thomas blocks his path and accuses him of resisting his authority. At this point, the situation turns more aggressive. Derek doesn't physically resist, but the officer, using his power, accuses him of doing so, simply because Derek isn't answering the way Thomas wants him to. In the officer's mind, Derek's refusal to be intimidated, his calmness is a challenge to his authority. Officer Thomas decides to arrest Derek on charges of resisting arrest, a common and often abused charge used to justify wrongful detainment. Derek, despite knowing his innocence, is handcuffed and led to the squad car. The tension builds as the officer maintains his irrational belief that Derek is hiding something or involved in criminal activity, all due to his biases. In the sterile, cold interrogation room, the power dynamics shift. Derek remains composed, while Officer Thomas's growing frustration threatens to reveal more about his own flaws than he realizes. Derek is taken to the police precinct, where Officer Thomas's aggression only intensifies. The officer now feels the weight of his decision, but instead of reflecting on his actions, he doubles down. Derek is placed in a dimly lit interrogation room, and Thomas begins asking more pointed questions, none of which have any legal basis, but are rooted in his racial assumptions. Thomas accuses Derek of being involved in criminal activity, questioning him relentlessly about his background, his purpose in the neighborhood, and why he was out so late. Derek, however, remains eerily calm and cooperative, answering with short, direct responses. He refuses to give away more information than what's necessary, knowing he has nothing to hide. Thomas, frustrated by Derek's composure and nonchalance, tries to escalate the situation, speaking to Derek in a condescending and dismissive manner. Derek doesn't bite. He simply asks for his lawyer. The officer's anger grows as he continues to press Derek, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify his actions. But Derek, no matter how much Thomas pushes, refuses to give him the satisfaction of a mistake. As the interrogation drags on, it's clear that the officer isn't trying to get to the truth. He's just trying to break Derek, to get him to confess to something, anything. Derek's silence is a weapon in itself. The tension in the room grows, with Derek's stoic resistance being the perfect foil to the officer's erratic behavior. Just when Officer Thomas thinks he's finally gained control, a bombshell revelation flips everything upside down. Derek's identity is far more significant than he ever could have imagined. The tension in the interrogation room peaks as Officer Thomas grows more frustrated and defensive. He's desperate to assert his authority, yet Derek's stoic silence only deepens his confusion. Thomas's mind races through the possibilities, and for a moment, he almost believes his own narrative, that Derek is hiding something. But then, the unexpected happens. A superior officer, Captain Lewis, arrives at the precinct. His presence immediately changes the atmosphere in the room. The captain has heard about the situation and steps in to check on Derek's status. He's clearly taken aback by the scene, a black man calmly sitting, surrounded by the mounting hostility of a frustrated officer. Captain Lewis requests to speak with Derek privately. As Captain Lewis starts to talk to Derek, a phone call comes through to the precinct. It's a call that shifts the entire direction of the night. The voice on the other end is from the FBI. The agent on the line confirms Derek's identity. He's not a criminal. Derek is, in fact, an undercover FBI agent who has been working on a high-profile case related to corruption in the local police force, a case that could implicate several officers, including Thomas himself. The room falls silent as the bombshell lands. Officer Thomas is stunned. His jaw tightens and he stares at Derek, now realizing that he's just arrested someone far more important than he ever could have imagined. Derek, calm and collected as always, produces his credentials, FBI identification, proof of his ongoing investigation and mission orders. The captain, now visibly uncomfortable, immediately orders Derek's release. But it's too late for Officer Thomas. The damage is done. Derek remains silent, his cool demeanor hiding his own personal disappointment in the officer's actions. The tension in the room is thick with the unspoken truth. Thomas's racism has not only led to a wrongful arrest, but it has also put the entire investigation at risk. As the realization sinks in, Officer Thomas is forced to confront the consequences of his actions. The career he's built, his reputation, and his worldview all hang by a fragile thread. Officer Thomas stands motionless as Derek is led out of the interrogation room. The gravity of the situation finally hits him, but it's not a sudden rush of guilt. Instead, it's a cold, uncomfortable awareness that he's just made a grave mistake. His hands tremble slightly as the weight of the arrest begins to settle in. The captain, now furious, pulls Officer Thomas aside for a private conversation. He scolds him harshly, reminding him of the potential consequences for both the department and the case Derek was working on. He warns Thomas that this isn't just a small error. This could mean internal investigations, scrutiny, and perhaps even career-ending repercussions for Thomas. But the officer, shaken but still proud, tries to defend his actions, blaming the circumstances and his gut feeling about Derek. He tries to justify his racism, claiming that the arrest was instinctual, as if his prejudice was somehow valid. But Captain Lewis isn't having it. He tells Thomas in no uncertain terms that his behavior is unacceptable and that the department will be looking into it. He reminds him that the truth has a way of coming out, and that Derek's mission, now compromised, could lead to further fallout. It's clear that Thomas is now on thin ice, and his future in law enforcement is uncertain. As the scene continues, Thomas watches Derek leave the precinct, the man he wrongfully arrested walking out without a word, his composure intact. The officer's sense of pride crumbles. He had no idea that he had been interacting with someone so important, someone who could have been an ally in exposing the very corruption he had been trying to cover up. For the first time, Officer Thomas has to confront the fact that his worldview is wrong. The world around him doesn't work the way he thought it did. Derek's calmness and dignity in the face of his unjust treatment have shaken something deep inside the officer. The internal conflict begins to simmer as he contemplates what comes next. The ripple effects of Officer Thomas's actions are felt across the entire police department. The arrest of an FBI agent ignites a scandal, and Officer Thomas's future now hangs in the balance. The news of the wrongful arrest quickly spreads through the precinct and beyond. Within hours, the internal investigation begins, and whispers of corruption and racial bias fill the air. Derek's case, which was already sensitive due to the ongoing FBI investigation, becomes a public embarrassment for the department. Captain Lewis is tasked with managing the fallout, and he makes it clear to the entire force that this will be dealt with swiftly and severely. The department is under the microscope now, and every officer is aware that any hint of misconduct will be scrutinized. What started as a simple act of discrimination has become a full-blown scandal. Officer Thomas is pulled from active duty, his badge temporarily suspended, while the investigation into his behavior is launched. He faces potential charges for false arrest, racial profiling, and abuse of power. His career, once built on his perceived authority, now seems like it could unravel in an instant. He's left to wonder how much longer he will be able to wear the uniform he's worn for so long. Meanwhile, Derek, who has been cleared of any wrongdoing, remains focused on his mission. Despite the setback caused by the arrest, his professionalism and commitment to the FBI investigation remain unwavering. He decides not to press charges against Thomas, knowing that the officer's actions will be addressed internally. Derek understands that his mission is much larger than one wrongful arrest, but it serves as a painful reminder of the systemic issues within law enforcement. The department begins to take a hard look at its culture, and Derek's case serves as a catalyst for deeper reflection on the biases and corruption that exist within the force. Officer Thomas, now realizing the extent of his mistake, faces not only the loss of his job but the difficult task of reconciling his beliefs with the reality of the consequences his actions have caused. In the aftermath of the chaos, the damage is done. Officer Thomas must now come to terms with the long-lasting effects of his actions, and Derek's quiet strength offers a deeper lesson in the fight against systemic injustice. Officer Thomas, now on administrative leave, spends his days in a haze of regret and confusion. His once unwavering confidence in his own righteousness begins to crumble as he faces the consequences of his racist actions. He has no idea where to turn or how to move forward. His career, his reputation, and his worldview are shattered. The internal investigation into his conduct continues. But for Thomas, the real punishment is internal. He begins to question everything he once believed. How had he been so blind to his own biases? How had he allowed his personal prejudices to dictate his professional decisions? He replays the arrest over and over in his mind, seeing the calm, collected man he mistreated, and it fills him with shame. The system that he once defended no longer feels like a source of pride. Instead, it feels like a web of corruption and failure. For Derek, life moves forward. He continues his work for the FBI, the botched arrest a small obstacle in the larger scope of his mission. He understands that the fight for justice is not always immediate, and often comes at great personal cost. Yet, his decision not to press charges against Officer Thomas speaks volumes. Derek knows that change in the system comes not only through action but through understanding and growth, something that Thomas may have to learn the hard way. As the story comes to a close, both men are left to reflect on what has transpired. For Thomas, there's the looming possibility of redemption, but it requires true introspection and a willingness to confront the person he used to be. For Derek, it's a reminder that the struggle for justice never truly ends, and that sometimes, even the smallest victories, like standing firm in the face of injustice, have the power to spark change. The story ends with an open question. Will Officer Thomas change, or will he remain a part of a system that enabled his prejudices? And for Derek, will the fight for justice ever truly end? The final reflection serves as a stark reminder that while change may be slow, it's always possible, but only if individuals are willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about themselves and the systems they uphold.